Hello, everyone, and welcome to Talk Nerdy. Today is Monday, October 30th, so happy Halloween Eve. I'm your host, Cara Santa Maria, and I want to start by thanking those of you who made Talk Nerdy possible this week. Remember, Talk Nerdy is and will always be 100% free to download, and that's mostly because of support from listeners like yourself. So first, I want to thank those of you who supported the show by becoming patrons, as it were, by visiting www.patreon.com/talknerdy and pledging your support on an episodic basis. I've got a lot of people supporting the show, and I can't thank them all, but I do offer every week to give a shout out to my highest level supporters, and they include Phil T-Bear, Timothy Glover, Rob Schreck, Pedro M. Rosario Barbosa, Jeffrey Perez, Charles Payette, Jonathan Wright, Christian Jeffrey, Stuart Ogue, The Honorable Husband, Jafe, Gabriel Felipe Jaramillo Gonzalez, Brian Holden, and Jeffrey Sewell. I also want to thank those of you who showed your support on the PayPal portal, including this week, it looks like, Todd Erickson, unless I already thanked you last week, and Richard Moan. All right. I also want to tell you about this week's show because it's such a good one, and I'm so glad we got to do this interview. So I had a wonderful chat with Dr. Kelly Weinersmith, and if you don't know who she is an infectious disease ecology, biology researcher. She actually focuses on parasites and specifically on how parasites affect their host behavior. Super weird, super awesome. But also, right now, you've probably noticed that she may be trending a bit in the news because along with her husband, Zach Weinersmith, who is the creator and artist and writer of the popular webcomic Saturday Morning Breakfast cereal, they've recently written a new book. It's called Soonish, 10 Emerging Technologies That'll Improve and or Ruin Everything. So I have a chance to talk to Kelly about her research, but also about all the cool work that went into this wonderful co-written book, and also how the hell you write a book with your husband and come out on the other end happy and healthy and all those good things. All right, guys, so without any further ado, here she is, Dr. Kelly Weinersmith. Well, Kelly, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
I am really excited to talk to you about your new book that you actually worked on with your husband, Zach Weinersmith, called Soonish, 10 Emerging Technologies That'll Improve and or Ruin Everything. So I have to start by asking you a little bit about your background because you yourself are a scientist, aren't you?
I am, yes.
And so, but you study parasites. You're a biologist. Why focus on technology in your book together?
Well, we both think that it's kind of fun to work on stuff that's totally outside of what we usually work on. And so this was just an excuse to study something else. And now let's be clear, parasites that manipulate host behavior are awesome. And you really don't need to do anything other than that for a lifetime to be happy. But we decided that this totally sort of off-topic thing would be a lot of fun to work on. And we both just were kind of excited about the excuse to read about technology for a while.
I love that. That's so great. Well, we're going to talk about both because I can't let you go from this podcast without talking about parasites that manipulate human behavior or any other behavior. Good. And of course, your husband, Zach, is the cartoonist behind Saturday Morning Breakfast cereal. And so it's a really cool way that you guys were able to integrate both of your backgrounds and both of your areas of expertise to put together this really graphic, beautiful book that's also super, super smart. What a fun thing. Have you been thinking about doing this for a long time?
Well, so no, not really. So we used to do a podcast called The Weekly Weinersmith together. And ever since we started dating, like a fundamental feature of our relationship is that we like to go on walks and talk about nerdy stuff we've been learning about. And like when we first started dating, we would go to the San Jose library, spend 5 hours reading, and then we would like go on walks and eat and talk about nerdy stuff. And so, yeah, so we're like, well, how about, the nerdy stuff that we talk about is maybe something we're going to write a book about. And so we just turned our like daily walks into our daily walks about our new project together. And I think it turned out pretty well.
I love that. And it's such a beautiful book. I had gotten the galleys previously, but getting the final hardcover copy in the mail was very exciting for me. And it's so fun and just really an easy read too, which I think is important. I mean, you learn a lot, but it doesn't feel like something that would be assigned in school, which I think is great when we're talking about popular science writing.
Yeah, I'm so glad to hear that. So first, we were so excited about the way the book ended up looking. The folks at Penguin just laid it out beautifully, picked beautiful paper, and we think it turned out really fantastic. We're really happy with the way it all looks. We're just generally, wait, there was something else that you said. You said the book.
It doesn't feel like something you would be assigned in school.
Good. Yeah. So our goal was to actually get pretty thick into all of these different technologies so that you would really understand them and really understand what the challenges were to making these technologies happen. But we knew that some of the topics were going to be sort of complicated. So we were hoping that the humor would sort of get you through, like there'd be a moment where you'd get bogged down, but then you'd laugh and you'd be ready to go on and like stick with us as we made it even more complicated. So it's good to hear that it didn't read like a complicated book, so we were hoping the humor would sort of lessen the burden there.
Absolutely, it does. And the good thing is a really cool professor could assign this in school, and then they would get like a ton of brownie points, and you would be like, I'm totally taking all the classes they offer.
Absolutely. And if any professors are out there, they should do that.
Absolutely. And I know that there are professors that listen to this podcast for sure. So hopefully somebody is thinking that right now. And so when we look at the actual content of the book, it's 10 emerging technologies, like it says in the subtext or the subtitle, that'll improve and or ruin everything. So I have to ask just right off the bat, what was the sort of over under on improving / ruining? More in one, more in the other? Did you find that it was a pretty good balance?
Well, so actually, in general, I feel like, you look at the title and it's pretty clear that we are two non-committal people when it comes to what the future of technology holds. And so, throughout the book, we didn't say how many years we thought it was going to take for technologies to work out, because I feel like that's a really quick way to make your book something that people laugh at in the future. Yeah. And then additionally, we don't tell you what we think in terms of, is this technology going to make things bad? Is it going to make things good? You can kind of decide for yourself, because it's really hard to predict what people are going to do with the technology once they have it. But that said, Zach and I are pretty optimistic people. So we at least want to believe that everything will be improved by these technologies, but that you definitely need to keep the potential negative implications in mind as you move forward and make legislation in a world where these technologies exist.
Absolutely. It's always important, I think, to find that balance. And, I talk about that a lot on this show, maybe even more so on The Skeptic's Guide, because some of the guys on that podcast that I work on are kind of like techno-optimists. And I think that sometimes it's important to have that conversation about, maybe it's not the scientists themselves who are in the lab trying to come up with, some sort of new machine to pull off, a piece of research, or trying to maybe optimize some sort of platform or system that's already in the works, that have to come up with the regulatory side of things. But it is important that there is a group of people, a group of important people who are saying, let's see whether or not this needs to be regulated and how, pretty much every step of the way.
Yeah, and so actually that was one of the very interesting things that I encountered while doing the interviews for this book. So I was the one who did, I think 99.9% of the interviews, and and that was part of the divide. Zach does the comics, I do the interviews, blah blah blah. But every time I would talk to someone, I would ask, how could this technology that you're working on make everything awful? And I expected everybody to have complicated answers that they had thought through. And I don't know if it was that people didn't want to sell a negative version of their technologies to me, but usually the answer was, oh, I don't know. I mean, we haven't thought too hard about that. We're really excited about the good stuff. And it's like, well, that's fine. I'm really excited about the good stuff too, but don't you have a drink every once in a while and think about these things, how it could make things bad? And I think that the mindset is that, hey, we have, for example, bioethicists whose job it is to think about the negative implications, and legislators whose job it is to think about the negative implications. But I feel like it would be nice if earlier in the process, everyone was meeting together and talking about the potential negative implications, because for some of these technologies, they're huge.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think it's probably about finding a balance, right? Like, you don't want to be so concerned that the technology you're working on is going to kind of go rogue or go bad that it cripples you and you don't keep making progress. But at the same time, you don't want to wear these rose-colored glasses and be like, I'll just leave that up to somebody else, because what if somebody else never comes along?
Yeah, yeah. I totally agree. And to some extent, so, I was talking to a lot of academic professors, and I understand that they have a ton of stuff going on. So they can't be a bioethicist and an economist. So that was another thing we noticed while researching this book, that the people weren't really thinking about how their technology was going to fit when it hit the market.
Yeah.
And in some cases, we have some examples in the book where that ended up being a problem. But I understand that you don't have time to train your students, do your administration stuff, teach classes, do your research, and be a bioethicist and an economist. But maybe we need to have more crosstalk between fields so those things are happening. It seems important to me.
Absolutely. And, the good news is that even though probably in your interviews you were finding that there was a little bit of siloism, that's not a word, that people were pretty siloed within their one individual goal, the good news is it does seem like slowly but surely interdisciplinary work is starting to take hold. More and more I meet young people whose college sort of trajectory is not as straight and narrow as I think they used to be in the past. People who are like, well, I'm more interested in this concept. And so because I'm interested in this concept, I'm taking, biotechnology, and I'm taking molecular biology, and I'm over here in the chemistry department. And I think that's really cool to see.
I agree. I do think people are becoming more interdisciplinary. I think funding sources want to see more of that, so it's forcing the old guard to do that as well to get the money. And I guess I would like to, so the things that you named are all still different sciences. And so I would like to see more people get into like, oh, I also have to take an ethics class, and I also have to take an economics class. And again, you don't want everyone to be stuck in college for 6 years and every professor can't do everything. But I do feel like we'd all be a bit more effective and efficient if we had our foot in those areas as well.
Yeah, I mean, even like taking a step back from there, what I found when I moved from psychology to biology, and now I'm back in psychology, was that like during my master's degree, the required statistics courses that I took were like so minimal compared to what I had to do in psych. And I remember thinking, geez, a lot of these biology students don't really have a good background in the basic math that they need to be able to write good papers. And also, it was never required that I took a class on how to write or how to teach.
Yeah, no, that blew my mind off. And so the more things we bring up, I feel like the more it becomes clear how hard it is to be in academia and juggle all of these balls. Because you have to be a statistician, a teacher, you have to know your particular field of science, you have to be a writer. But like, we're not very well prepared for a lot of this stuff. I remember when I taught for the first time, one semester I was on one side of the table, and the next semester I was on the other side of the table teaching the class, and there had been no talk about how you teach in between. And it was a moment of just shock looking out at the students being like, I don't know what I'm doing on this side of the table, but fake it till you make it.
And exactly.
Yeah.
We'll figure it out together. And You're right. Like, it's so crazy how many, the people who are tasked with teaching the brightest minds don't really have any formal training in teaching. We spend all this time training our, educators to teach in primary and secondary school. But by the time you actually get to undergrad and graduate school, most of those people who are teaching never really learned how to do that. Luckily, a lot of universities will kind of cater to the people who want to teach more courses, and oftentimes it's kind of self-selecting, and the people who want to teach more courses are the people who happen to be kind of good at it and enjoy it. But in grad school, you might have a professor teaching a really specific course who is not a good teacher and has no idea how to do it, but they're just the only person in that department who knows anything about that topic.
It's true. And some universities are getting better. Like when I started at the University of California, Davis for my PhD, you had to take like a a seminar or something on teaching skills, and then you were told,
Oh, that's good.
yeah, and then you were told, like, we have these people who would love to come and record your class and then go over with you the things that you did wrong. And that's like a daunting and scary thing. You don't really want to have someone sit you down and be like, here's how you embarrassed yourself in front of 50 undergrads. But it's an important tool and an important step. And so there's definitely some universities that are working on making resources available. But then it's hard with all the other demands that, for example, grad students have to make time for that kind of thing. But hopefully they do.
Absolutely. So when did you become a professor? Like, when did you finish all of your academic training and move into, it's a fuzzy line, I think, crossing over from being in school to being a professor at school?
Yeah, it's a very fuzzy line. So I finished my PhD in 2014, and then I got a postdoc at Rice University, the Huxley Fellowship in Ecology and Evolution. And that fellowship was like a mini professor position. So I taught a couple classes, but mostly I was doing research. I could mentor some undergrads, and it was like a trial run at being an assistant professor. And then the next step in the process was going to be to apply for assistant professor jobs. But secretly, I've had this dream of starting an ecology research station and like buying land and starting one in my backyard and setting up greenhouses and doing my research from home. And this book has now allowed us to do that. So we just moved to Virginia to look for land, and we're going to set up a lab. So I'm adjunct assistant professor. I'm not an official assistant professor, and that I don't have grad students or anything, but I'm setting up this field station instead. So that's my new path.
That is so cool. Once it's all set and you're really dig deep into it, do you think that you'll have like students coming and helping you work at your home lab?
Oh, I hope so. Yeah. So we're hoping we're hoping we have students that can like run experiments all year long. They can, plant trees in our yard if they want. And, our yard, we're hoping is going to be like 50 acres or something. And then we're hoping to have a little cottage where people who want to write papers with me can come and we can work on projects for however long they stay. Or maybe someone could stay with us for sabbatical. So we're hoping that, we'll have a lot of faculty and students come through.
Oh, that's so smart, because so many people I find in academia sort of need this place where they can get away to work. Like I find that a lot of my friends are really successful when they like go down to the jungle for 6 months at a time and really focus on their field work. And then they just feel it's like that whole go to a cabin in the woods to write phenomenon where you just can flow a little more if you get outside of your typical sort of fluorescent lighting laboratory.
I totally agree with you. And so we're hoping that will draw people to come work at our station for a while.
That is so cool. Okay, so we're sort of talking around it, but I want to know all about your research. We'll get back to the book later, I promise. But I want to know all about your research. So you study parasites, specifically the types of parasites that can sort of exert changes on their hosts. Tell me about, your favorite parasites, the ones you really focus on, and what they do.
Well, so I'll tell you about a parasite that my colleagues and I discovered recently because it's totally my favorite parasite right now.
Yes, please.
Yeah, so I was working with this guy. I'm working with this guy, Scott Egan. He's a professor at Rice University. And when he was on vacation with his family, he was walking along the beach with his daughter, and he noticed that there were these stems that were infected by a gall wasp that he studies. And gall wasps are these wasps where they lay eggs into some part of these trees, and then they, through mechanisms we don't quite understand, they induce the tree to make little compartments that they live in. So sometimes you'll see a leaf with a bunch of fuzzy stuff on the bottom, and there's a little wasp living in the middle of the fuzzy stuff. But in this particular case, this is the crypt gall wasp, Basidia pallida. And what happens is the mom lays an egg in the stem, and it causes this little compartment to be made, and this compartment is called a crypt. And in that, which is just such an awesome name.
It's such a good name.
Such a good name. And so in that crypt, the egg hatches, the wasp undergoes development, and when it becomes an adult, if it doesn't get infected by anything, it chews a hole through the stem, and then it leaves and goes off for the next stage of its life cycle. So that's what's happening with the host. So when the host is unlucky, the crypt keeper wasp comes along, and this is a parasitoid, and parasitoids are a kind of parasite that need to kill their host in order to complete their life cycle.
Ooh, yeah, so they're like the most pernicious.
They're pretty bad, yeah. This is like fitness to zero kinds of of infection. So the mom lays the egg in the crypt with the host, And through mechanisms we don't understand yet, but we're hoping to get to at some point, the parasitoid causes the host to make an emergence hole that's smaller than usual and then plug it with its head. And so then when the parasitoid is ready to emerge, it eats a hole through the host's head and it emerges, which is just so creepy and so awesome. And the way we kind of discovered this is that when the crypt keeper wasp, which is the host, so when the host is making a bunch of crypts in these stems, the stem looks a little bit puffy. It's almost like the tree has an immune response, sort of like we have when we get, an infection and the skin gets puffy, the stem kind of gets puffy. And Scott Egan just has this amazing ability to recognize these things. And so he was like, oh, there's a puffy stem. So he pulled a bunch of them off, and he loves gall wasps so much that he always has Ziploc bags in his pockets. Mm-hmm. And so he pulled his Ziploc bags out on vacation and grabbed these stems, and he brought them back to the lab. And then he kind of forgot about them. And then he looked at them a month or two later, and he noticed that a bunch of the hosts had plugged the holes, and then they hadn't come out. And then some of the heads had holes in them. And so he looked, and there was a parasitoid in there. And I had just started working at Rice, and he was like, so this is weird. Could this be manipulation? And I was like, oh my gosh, we have to check. And so we got this amazing undergrad named Sean Liu to work with us. And we got Andrew Forbes, who's this guy who does some cool insect taxonomy stuff. He does a lot of other stuff also, but that's what he did for this project. And so he looked at the parasitoid, and it turns out that the parasitoid had not been described previously. So it was a new species to science, which was just like my dream come true, being involved in describing a new species.
So did you guys get to name it?
Heck yeah, we did. and so it keyed out to a genus called Uterus, Euderus, not Uterus.
That's funny. Yeah.
And so I like making jokes about how I feel like I'm a kindred spirit with this parasite because we both have names that remind people of the human reproductive tract. But anyway, I love this parasite for so many reasons, that being one of them. So we didn't get to pick the genus name. That was already set. But we decided to give it a species name of Set, after the Egyptian god Set, who was the god of like chaos and evil. But particularly he trapped his brother Osiris in a crypt to kill him, and then scattered his body parts. And when you dissect, it's so perfect. And when you dissect a crypt, the body parts of the host are just scattered all around the crypt. So it just like matched up on a million different levels. And so we called it the Crypt Keeper Wasp and named our paper Tales from the Crypt. And I totally love this system. And so it looks like the manipulation is happening because the Crypt Keeper Wasp is kind of wimpy and it's not very good at cutting through the stem on its own. So if you just put a tiny little piece of bark over the head of the host when it's plugging the hole, that the parasitoid is 3 times more likely to die trapped inside. So it can't get through even a tiny piece of bark. So the manipulation is to make it easy for the parasitoid to get out when it's ready to develop.
Yeah. I love this. This is fascinating. And you weren't joking. I'm looking at your publications list on your website. You legit titled your academic paper that was published in the Proceedings of the Royal Society, Tales from the Crypt.
I did.
It makes me so happy.
When we figured out that we could do that, we were so excited. And when Scott was describing the system to me and he was saying, oh yeah, they're called crypts, I was like, oh, this system is awesome. I can't wait till we write the paper. And I generally these days try to write my papers so that even the general public could also understand them, because that's who's paying for most of the science.
Absolutely.
And so, and sometimes that gets me in trouble. Sometimes I'll submit a paper and I'll get comments back about like, well, this doesn't really read like a science paper. And I'm like, well, but you understood it, right? So, and if you don't have a problem with the science and it's not jargony, I don't feel like that's a problem. But anyway,
I have to say you're a saint for that. I'm really struggling right now, not to make the conversation turn into something about me, but I've been out of academia for 10 years. I just started my PhD, restarted. I dropped out of a PhD a while back. So I'm starting a new path in a PhD now. And just the writing, it's like I'm having to unlearn everything. So I used to write academic papers, and then I became a popular science communicator, and now I'm going back into academia. And it's like, it's frenetic trying to figure out how to not make all of these mistakes and getting dense and terse and using all this jargon again. And it like hurts my soul a little bit.
Oh, I hear you. I read, I've been working in this field for like a decade now, and sometimes I read papers where I have to read them a couple times to get it, and I'm like,
Yeah.
why does it need to be that way? Why can't we? I mean, in some cases, yes, you need jargon because jargon has very specific meaning and it helps you be clear. But I think a lot of times we use jargon because it makes you sound super smart, and then everyone will know how smart you are. And I'd rather be clear. But
me too. And I'd rather not read a paper, like a 20-page paper, and then afterward be like, I don't know anything I just read.
Yeah.
I want my life back.
Yep, I hear you.
Oh man. No, but this makes me so happy. Not only is that a fascinating organism and like what a fun story, but also I love that this was a new discovery to science. I love that you got to be involved in that discovery process. Kind of what a boon for any researcher. How incredibly exciting. And of course, this isn't the only organism that you study. You go from wasps to fish to, it's not just about like the bug or the bug in a euphemism way, not just about an insect or a little microscopic organism, right? Like the cool thing about parasites is they run the gamut across plants, animals, like all living things.
Yeah, they do. Almost nothing is safe from parasites, and a lot of the very common organisms or like very abundant organisms that you find in nature are infected by parasites that manipulate their behavior. So my other study system are California killifish, Fundulus parvipinus. So this is a tiny silver fish, like, maybe the length of a bit longer than your middle finger. And this is the most abundant fish in salt marshes in Southern California. And they're infected by a brain-infecting trematode called Euhaplorchus californiensis. And I'm kind of lazy, so I call it EUHA for short.
Love it.
Yeah. And so this parasite has a complex life cycle. It starts off by breeding in the guts of predatory birds, and there it makes eggs. And when the bird defecates, the eggs fall into salt marshes where they're accidentally eaten by California horned snails. And as if it wasn't enough of an insult to be accidentally eating feces infected with eggs, the snails are subsequently castrated by the parasite.
Oh, God.
So all of the energy that they would have put towards making their own offspring, it now goes towards making this parasite, which reproduces asexually and produces thousands of free-swimming stages that when the tide comes in, they leave the snail and they start swimming towards the light in the hope that they'll encounter a California killifish. And when they do, they burrow through the skin of the killifish and they follow nerves up to the brain, and then they make these cysts. So if you dissect a killifish brain, it has all of these tiny little almost clear balls on top of its head. And each one of those little balls is a parasite that was independently acquired while the fish was swimming around.
Oh, wow. And do most of them have them, or is it like a small percentage?
So almost all of them have them.
Wow.
And in fact, so when a fish hatches and you catch it in the wild, you know that it hatched recently if it still has a little bit of yolk. And so you can say, oh, this is a very young fish. And so I've caught fish that still have some yolk. So they hatched, within the last couple days, and they already have this parasite on the brain.
Wow.
And by the time they're adults, they can have up to 8,000 of them.
And so is it the kind of thing where the parasite is more symbiotic? Like, does it affect them at all? Because it seems like they're able to live their lives with it.
So they can live their lives with it, and surprisingly, they swim pretty normally, they eat pretty normally, and they seem pretty normal, but every once in a while, they'll do something like contort their body in the shape of a C, or shoot forward really quickly, or flip upside down. And when they flip upside down, the sun reflects off of their belly. And so if you watch a school of infected fish swim by, it almost looks like they're dancing, and there's all these like lights that come up off the school as the fish flip upside down, and it's kind of beautiful, but caused by parasites. And and the more of the parasites that are on a fish's brain, the more often they do this stuff, and the more likely they are to get eaten by a predatory bird. And that completes the life cycle for the parasite.
Yeah. Oof, man. And so it's funny that it's kind of integrated itself into this other organism's life cycle so completely. And since they don't die young, they can continue to reproduce. So it works for the parasite. I mean, kind of sad for the fish, but I guess the fish still have a relatively healthy life cycle, enough that, they haven't evolved some sort of resistance against it.
Well, so they're still the most abundant fish in these ecosystems, despite having them, pretty much every single one of them having this parasite on the brain. And so it looks like a lot of them live to be old enough to reproduce. So the parasite doesn't seem to kill them off right away. It takes a while for them to accumulate enough. And the parasite isn't reproducing at this stage. All of the reproduction is happening asexually in the snails and then sexually in the predatory birds. They just kind of hang out on the brains of the fish. And presumably there's got to be some arms race going on here and some maybe neuroimmune response, which we're working on trying to quantify right now. But it does seem like the parasite is doing a pretty good job at the moment of manipulating behavior. So if there is an arms race, the killifish certainly aren't far ahead in the arms race. But yeah, it's a fascinating system.
Absolutely. So when you first mentioned, and I was first reading that you work with parasites that specifically manipulate behavior, the first thing I always think of when I hear that is toxoplasmosis. But I also don't know how much of that is like known and how much of that is sort of like overly excitable science writing. And I know that you don't specifically focus on toxo, but because that's the first thing that comes to my mind, I was wondering if you knew much about it or if you could clarify this idea of this like cat poop parasite that like actually affects people.
Sure. So can I start with the background on the life cycle of the parasite?
Absolutely. Please.
Okay. So Toxoplasma gondii is a protozoan parasite, and when it's in the guts of a cat, it reproduces and makes oocysts that when the cat defecates, they end up in the environment. So just like with the trematode I was talking about a second ago, when the host where sexual reproduction happens poops, that's how the infective stage gets into the environment. And then almost any warm-blooded animal can get infected. So, if a pig comes and eats it, it can get infected. If your dog comes and eats it, it can get infected. And if we accidentally ingest it, we can get infected. And so you can accidentally ingest it by like playing in a sandbox and not washing your hands, gardening and not washing your hands, not cleaning your fruits and vegetables well enough before you eat them. So there's lots of ways you can get it from the environment. And what happens when we or any other warm-blooded animal eats it is that it moves into like our muscles and our brain, and it forms cysts, and it will live there for the rest of its life. So there's no medication once this parasite establishes that you can take that will get rid of it. This is your forever friend. And so when this parasite infects rodents, particularly when it infects rats go from being afraid of the smell of cat urine, which is their natural response to the smell of this particular predator, to actually being attracted to the smell of cat urine. And I think it was Patrick Hall who did work showing that the part of the brain in the rat that gets like turned on when they're infected and they smell cat urine is the part associated with sexual arousal. So
weird.
Yeah, so the rats go from being like, to being like, yeah, okay. And so presumably they end up by spending more time around the smell of cat urine, they are more likely to get eaten by a cat, and that completes the life cycle for the parasite. But we actually haven't tested that part empirically. And I think that's because most of us feel queasy about the idea of releasing rats into an environment and then letting cats kill them. So, so like the closer an animal is to us, the less comfortable we feel about predation studies. And I'm fine with that. I don't think I'd want to run that study either, but I would like to know. I would like to know the answer. So I'm kind of hoping that one day someone can do like the right field study to get that data. But at the moment, we haven't actually proven, the way or supported the way that science can support that part of the story. But anyway, so someone noted that, in humans, we often feel like we have the flu after we get infected, but we have this parasite for the rest of our lives. And if it changes the behavior of rats, well, maybe it also changes the behavior of people. And so Jaroslav Flager, he's a scientist from the Czech Republic. He started giving undergrads and members of the Czech army personality tests. And then
Okay.
and then he'd look at how their responses on personality tests compared depending on whether or not they happen to be infected. So he'd draw blood after the personality test and say, okay, the individuals who are infected by this parasite, do they behave or respond differently to this test than the ones who are uninfected? And because you have this parasite for the rest of your life, your body's always making antibodies to it, and you can do tests to see if you have antibodies or not. And he found that, like, for example, males who are infected by this parasite are more concerned about gender roles, and they're less likely to follow rules. And women who are infected become more warm and more caring. And, all this stuff started popping up on personality tests as being
weird.
Associated. Yeah, and it is weird. And Kevin Lafferty said, oh, well, I wonder if that stuff scales to the level of culture, because there's a lot of cultural differences in how many people get infected by this. So in France, for example, there's I think something like 80% of the population is infected, and that's because they like to eat undercooked meat. And so another way to get the parasite is to eat the cysts that are in the muscle of, for example, a cow. So if you eat an infected cow, it's not cooked through all the way, then you can get infected again by that parasite. Yeah. And so when women get pregnant, they often go to the doctor and get a test to see if they have this parasite or not. Because if you get infected while you're pregnant, the parasite can cross the placenta and infect the fetus and cause major neurological issues.
Yeah, that's not good.
Real bad. And so for a lot of countries, we know what percent of at least the women in that population have the parasite because we have all this data from the pregnant women. And so he looked to see if the personality scores at a country level in Western countries correlated with the percent of the people in that country that are infected. And he found that countries that have a higher percent of their population that are infected by the parasite also tend to care more about gender roles. So it's more important that the man is the breadwinner and the woman is at home being warm and caring with the kids. And there's also a correlation between neuroticism, where countries that are more neurotic tend to have more of the parasite. And so this is all interesting, and you're like, oh, maybe this parasite is influencing culture. But like you said, it's really easy to get excited about this and over-report. So it could just be that countries where gender roles are really important also happen to be countries where the women are out doing more gardening around feral cats, and they're more likely to get infected that way. And so the only real way to get a handle on what this parasite does to human personality would be to infect people and measure their behavior before and after, which you can't do because ethics.
It's not ethical. Yeah.
Yeah, not at all. And so, I mean, you could follow people throughout their lifetime and then keep track of who gets the parasite and track personality changes. But the problem with doing something like that is that it could be certain personality types are more likely to get the parasite, and then their behaviors were going to, accentuate over time anyway. So it's really hard to study stuff like this in humans because of ethics, and we don't want to do the kinds of manipulative experiments we'd need to really get a handle on it. But there's at least tantalizing evidence that there's some association between this parasite and human personality. But yeah, we'll never have the data we need to really nail it down.
Yeah, I mean, it makes a good story, the crazy cat lady who has a million cats in her house has this parasite that makes her love cats or something like that. But it's really not that simple. I think we, as consumers of science news, we sometimes want things to be that simple. But unfortunately, human behavior is so freaking complex. It's probably a little bit, not easier, but maybe a little bit more clear studying the behavior of, an insect or some sort of organism in the wild that has a specific task that they do all of the time, and that task is interrupted by a parasite or is changed in some way by a parasite. Whereas humans, what is goal-oriented behavior in a human? Come on.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. We have social sciences that dedicate their entire field to that,
Yeah. No, it's really complicated. Toxoplasma gondii was the first parasite that I learned about that manipulates behavior, and I really wanted to study it. And then eventually I was like, no, I'd rather have fish where I can infect them and look at how behavior changes. And it's a little bit easier to define behavior in fish, although it's actually still moderately complicated. Yeah. But yeah, humans are it's way too complicated. And then I decided I didn't want to study anything that could infect me.
Yeah, that's smart. Yeah, vertebrates on the whole are pretty complicated. Obviously, somewhat more complicated than insects or something like that. But you're right. Like it would be just endlessly confusing to study that in humans. And like you said, you can't. It's like ethically just not okay to do that.
Yeah, totally.
That's fascinating, though. It's just so I'm thinking about this more and more because I just went to Africa. I got back about a week ago, and I have a really bad cold. I don't think I got it in Africa. I think I got it at SciComm camp, which was immediately after I got home. But my producer was telling me that every time she goes to Africa for work, we were there for a film shoot, she was saying she usually sees her infectious disease doctor because even though she doesn't feel sick, she almost always has a parasite. And so it's just a good idea to take an antiparasitic. They test her poop and they test her blood, and then she usually has to take something to clear it. And I haven't gone to see an infectious disease doctor, and like it's all I can think about now.
I think I would go just because I would want to know from like a fascination standpoint.
Yeah, right.
But it's so that's such an interesting point that that you go as part of an expedition, you're there for maybe a couple weeks, you come back and you're already infected by something. And I feel like that just really clarifies just how hard it is to live day to day in a place like that, where you just accumulate more and more of these parasites over time. And it's just harder and harder, like, for example, to go to work because the more parasites you have, in some cases, the more blood they're draining from you, the more exhausted you get, the more anemic. And if you become infected in just a couple weeks, it's really tough to live there full time, I think, from a parasite perspective.
Yeah, and it makes you start thinking about all of the like complicated ecological factors, right? Like as a Westerner, is it that my immune responses aren't really sufficient to deal with the types of microorganisms that may be existing in such a different area because I've never been exposed? Or, so do people who are native to these parts of Africa have better sort of accommodation for these types of parasites? Or is it simply the case that in places where the water is just not as clean, everybody is dealing with the burden of the parasites the same way, and and they really are just a little bit sicker all the time, but you don't really notice. Like all of these things are just fascinating, because we do evolve ways to accommodate for these things over time, but not always.
Yeah, no, so it's definitely the case that people from different areas could respond differently to the parasites. There's good evidence that something like schistosomiasis, which is a trematode that you can get by going into the water, is a very recurring chronic problem in a lot of populations where the parasite exists and they have to go out into the water for bathing or collecting food or whatever. There's good evidence that they have so there's one parasite that lives in like the veins around the urinary bladder. And every once in a while you'll see blood in the urine that, for girls is maybe mistaken for a period, and for boys for a while was thought to be a rite of passage, but is actually just the urinary bladder has calcified so much as the body tries to catch the eggs as they try to move through, that it's just totally damaged, and it's just blood in the urine from that. And so you get there is a lot of burden from infectious diseases, but I'm sure there's also a lot of variability in responses to how Westerners respond to their parasites and how people who live there respond as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's like you see, and I mean, it's an extreme example, and it's not an immune example. It's actually an evolutionary example over probably hundreds, thousands of years, is this example of individuals with sickle cell anemia who, maybe they're carriers, they're heterozygous for it, have improved malarial response. Like, that's fascinating to me that individuals have this trait where, in one variation of it, it could make them quite sick, but in other variations, it can be really protective of something that is in the environment that they experience all the time. I'm just, blown away. I love it. I love biology. It's so cool.
Oh, it's awesome. So have you heard of the hygiene hypothesis?
No, tell me everything.
Oh my gosh. Okay, so so the hygiene hypothesis is essentially the idea that for vertebrates, as our immune systems evolved, they evolved in the presence of parasites. Particularly, it was very common, for example, for all humans to have something like hookworms or just some sort of nematode living in our gut. And our immune systems came to just expect them to be there. And as a way to reduce the cost of being infected by them, the immune system started to be like, okay, look, you're always here. So I'm just going to use you as the cue to stimulate the production of particular cells. And in this case, what we think is happening is that they're stimulating the production of cells whose job it is to go around and figure out what is self. So like, okay, that's my liver. I leave that alone. And what doesn't belong. So it would be like, okay, there's a nematode doesn't belong. We'll figure out what to do with that, but we're identifying that doesn't belong here. And so if you don't have parasites, you make fewer of these cells that go around figuring out what belongs and what doesn't. Mm-hmm. And if you never get infected, or particularly if you don't get infected when you're very young and your immune system is developing, then you end up in a situation where you start attacking things you shouldn't. So you start attacking yourself, or you start attacking, like you have really horrible allergies because pollen, which you should ignore, your body doesn't know to ignore, so you attack it. And now, so we have all of these autoimmune diseases now that we didn't have as much of in the past. And you can actually plot over time as like hygienic conditions get better in particular countries, they're more likely to have things like irritable bowel disease or really, really horrible allergies, and just basically these various autoimmune diseases. And so the idea is that, you know, maybe like 2 hookworms is good because it stimulates your immune system to do what it needs to do. And I should say we're not 100% clear on the mechanism. There's a ton of people working on this. But like having a couple hookworms seems to be protective, but having a ton is really bad because it causes anemia and it slows you down and blah, blah, blah. And so there are a lot of different serious doctors at serious medical institutions who are starting to treat things like MS with hookworms. And or pig whipworm. So pig whipworm is a kind of nematode that you find in pigs, not in people. We're not really great hosts for it, so the parasite doesn't reproduce well inside of us, but it can eat.
So it like hangs out for a while, but then dies.
Yes, just long enough, and so like people will actually see their symptoms, the symptoms of their autoimmune disease, go away for the average lifetime of these parasites, and then when the parasites die, the symptoms come back. And that is not true across the board. There's plenty of studies where they don't find that, and it's a complicated field. And actually, there's a book called An Epidemic of Absence, which is a really great book written about the hygiene hypothesis. That sort of goes through all of these studies and summarizes what we know and what we don't know. But there's at least some evidence that having small numbers of parasites of a particular type may be good for the development of our immune system and may help keep everything sort of on track.
I mean, it makes sense, right? It actually does kind of resonate the same way that you think about, you know, like bubble boys, like parents who raise their kids to be just like overly clean. And that's, of course, within a single lifespan, not across multiple generations, but like kids who aren't ever allowed to get dirty or get infections tend to have really like sort of not good immune systems. Like they tend to be very quick to get sick because they just never are able to utilize sort of the skills that our immune systems did develop over multiple generations. Like we do have an internal ability to fight off disease. That's our first line of defense before antibiotics or antivirals or any of those things. Mm-hmm. And can you imagine never being able to exercise that and then getting hit hard by something? Like how scary.
Oh yeah. I mean, so the way I think about it is, you know, we're never alone. And whether your outlook on life determines whether or not you think that's creepy or somewhat comforting. But like, you know, for example, some people who take antibiotics, that wipes out their normal gut community. And then if you end up with something like Clostridium difficile, which is a kind of bacteria that you can have in your gut, it can be totally fine. But when it ends up being alone in your gut, it starts making this toxin that can cause horrible diarrhea and it can kill you. And so if you don't have your community that we evolved with, you know, there's a lot of ways in which we depend on that community. And it seems like it kind of throws everything off if you don't have it. So, you know, kids going outside and getting out of the bubble and getting some dirt in their mouths, maybe that's good for us. And there's some evidence that it is, but it's definitely an evolving field. So don't have your kids go out and like lick your boots.
Yeah. They should still wash their hands. Yeah, yes. They should still wash their hands after they handle cat poop. Absolutely.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. There's lots of things out there that you don't want. So you should be exercise caution as well.
Yeah, no, for sure, for sure. But how is a kid going to learn that the corner of the table is hard and hurts unless the kid hits himself against the corner of the table? You know what I mean? There is always that kind of vibe too. But of course, this is coming from somebody who has no kids, so maybe don't listen to anything I'm saying.
Well, as someone who has kids, no, I agree. Like, if you see that they're going to do something stupid, you make sure they do it under like only slight, a situation where it will hurt them just enough that they won't do it again.
Yeah.
But you don't want them to learn that lesson when they're falling off of something tall, for example. So
exactly. Yeah, you don't want to learn the lesson if it could cause death.
Right, exactly.
Not a good idea.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh. Okay, so this has been so much fun talking about parasites, but I would be remiss because we are talking about your new book, Soonish, and I would be remiss if we didn't actually talk more about the book. I love the artwork in it. I love that you are featured prominently. Are you often featured in Zach's cartoons? Or is this like a new thing?
I'm often featured. So he has a little red button that you can put, or that you can click on underneath the main comic. And the red button is sort of like an extra bonus thing that's related to the comic, but you totally get the comic if you don't click on the red button. And sometimes the red button is me scowling at Zach and telling him something about how I think the joke was stupid or blah, blah, blah. And now he started integrating the children, and I'm holding the children and we're scowling at him together. And so actually, it's interesting because a lot of people meet me and think that I am going to be very grumpy because I look very grumpy the way he draws me, but I'm not actually a grumpy person. But anyway, so I get drawn into those a lot, but I don't get drawn into the main comic very often, just because the main comic doesn't really have any characters, so that wouldn't really fit.
But I love that, like, for example, in the chapter that you have on bioprinting, there's a great comic where you are saying to Zach, I am not asking a scientist if we can print and consume people meat. And he's like, oh, it's always softball questions with you. And something tells me that was like an actual conversation that you guys had.
So that one wasn't, but there's another, there's another comic where we're talking about, there are some scientists, I think at NASA, who were talking about how you can turn human feces back into food on long journeys. And they call it closing the loop.
Of course they do.
Of course, which I think tells you a lot about food scientists. And like that loop, I don't think needs to be closed. But I think that there's a comic that says something like, I'm saying like, honestly, if they called it repooping, I'd be totally for it, just because I thought that was hilarious. And the face that Zach makes in the comic is pretty close to the face he made in real life when we were talking about this. And so some of the comics, really happened while we were talking and working on the book, and others were just kind of, a little artistic license.
I love that. I think it's so cool that you have the kind of relationship where you were able to really co-write this book and still be married afterward. That's incredibly impressive to me. I love that you have your own background and your own strengths, and you were able to bring those different things to the book. And I also kind of selfishly love that this is a book that's right up my alley, probably right up the alley of most of the listeners to Talk Nerdy, because you really do talk about technology, but you don't do it in like a gadgety way. You do it in a really scientific way, which is, after my own heart. So let's focus on some of those technologies. As you were writing the book, for example, was there a particular futurism topic or a particular thing that you learned that you didn't know before that really captured your attention? Did anything really stand out to you?
Well, so what I really liked about writing this book was there were a number of different technologies where we thought, okay, we'll write a chapter on this and it's going to be super easy because we totally already know what's going to happen with this technology, and we're just going to get the references to support what we think we already know. And it ended up not being what we thought at all. So, for example, asteroid mining, we thought the whole point was that you go out, you wrangle an asteroid, you bring it back to Earth, and then you sell all of the platinum, and we suddenly have twice as much platinum as we've ever had on the planet, and everybody rejoices. But it turns out that if you go out, you wrangle an asteroid, and you bring a ton of precious metal back, you crash the market. And the $1 billion or more investment you made in going out to get that asteroid and bringing it back is totally destroyed, because you bring that much back and you're going to get a much smaller price per pound, especially if there's competition and multiple people are bringing these asteroids back. So it turns out that that's not going to be the economically viable way to do asteroid mining. But there are still asteroid mining companies like Deep Space Industries, who we talked to in the book. And it turns out what they're planning on doing is going out to the asteroids and then doing things like extracting water from the asteroids and bringing them to the International Space Station. And the reason you want to do that is because it costs $10,000 per pound to get something off of Earth and into space. And that's because our atmosphere is so hard to get through. But once you get out of our atmosphere, it's really easy to move around and not very energetically expensive. So you could go to the asteroids and bring water to the International Space Station, maybe at a much lower cost than if that water came from Earth. And then additionally, you can mine the asteroids for things like precious metals to build space bases and rocket ships or spaceships. Or you can mine them for silicates to make solar panels to run your spaceship. And so the plans now mostly are to go out and mine these materials to set up space bases and then go out and explore the universe. And so this might be the thing, like this, we joke that the asteroid belt is our junkyard in the backyard, but the stuff in our junkyard might be what allows us to go out and explore space, because we can use that stuff and there's tons of it out there and we don't have to bring it out of Earth's atmosphere, and we can build there and then go out and explore the universe. And
that's fascinating.
And it was not what we expected. And so that was really cool, but it's also kind of scary. So, we tried to talk about concerns for each of these technologies. And one of the things that surprised us about this technology, or one of the things we hadn't thought about initially, was that once you have the ability to wrangle asteroids, and once that ability is common, and there's a bunch of people out there capturing asteroids, you now also have the ability to bring the ultimate weapon back to Earth, and you have the ultimate higher ground. And if you fling a giant asteroid at Earth, we all know what happens. It's really horrible because it's happened before, and there's giant craters, and it can be worse than any atomic bomb that we've set off. And so the more people there are out in space, the more you just have to hope that nobody does anything horrible like this and decides that they're going to fling something at Earth. You hope that because that destruction would be a little bit hard to control and could kill, your own people, you hope that no bad actors would ever do something like that. But humanity doesn't always have a great track record. So it's a little bit scary to think that this technology that could maybe make us a spacefaring species could also give us a new ultimate weapon. So weighing those different things is something we leave to the reader, but we present them with these different scenarios.
Yeah, it is fascinating how it does seem to be that something about human nature that for every cooperative, important, evolutionary, progressive thing that comes along, there's obviously an underbelly to it that can be utilized for personal gain, that can be, kind of fucked with and have a really negative outcome. And it's sort of like there's always going to be somebody who will do something like that. So you can't just assume that won't be the case. It's so interesting how just that story you were telling, I know that people are going to love this book because I'm thinking back to all the episodes of Talk Nerdy that I've done over the years. I did an episode with a gentleman named Phil Torres, who is an eschatologist, which is the philosophy of sort of the end of days, the philosophy of the rapture or the apocalypse. But he specifically is a secular eschatologist. So he doesn't really focus on the end of the days from like a biblical standpoint. He focuses on the way that technology could bring about a sort of apocalyptic situation. So, I mean, right there, we talked about some of these different concepts. And then, of course, I recently interviewed Carrie Nugent, who's at Caltech, and she is an asteroid hunter. She studies asteroids and catalogs them so that they won't come slamming into Earth. And I'm like, oh my gosh, worlds are colliding literally. This makes me so happy. Okay, so what else? This is about 10 emerging technologies that'll improve and or ruin everything. Maybe we can talk about one more before we go that was especially interesting to you.
So one of the other ones that I thought was really interesting was brain-computer interfaces.
Ooh, yeah.
Yeah. So the idea here is that you have a little device that sort of measures what you're thinking and what you want to do, and then it can respond to that in some way. So, for example, if you are an amputee and you've lost an arm, maybe this device can read that you have just had the thought, I would like to move my arm. And then it can take that information and it can send that information to an advanced prosthetic and it can move the arm for you. And so the brain-computer interface essentially interfaces your brain with something else.
And this is something we've done like somewhat successfully in primates previously, right?
Yeah, yes. And something that we're getting better at doing with people. So different groups have used electrocorticography to measure it essentially like measures what your brain is doing, and then it translates that into like I think there's some videos of a person who is now able to like move fingers and pick up things and do delicate motions like, you know, pouring coffee into a cup or something like that. And so we're getting pretty specific, and we're getting pretty good control of these things, which, you know, has the potential to make a lot of people's lives better. But, you know, anyone who's lost a limb for any reason, or anyone who's become a quadriplegic for any reason. So this is really important research. And there are some people who are using brain-computer interfaces to treat things like freezing gait. And then other people are putting like deep brain stimulators in brains for like epilepsy and for seizures to try to stop a seizure before it starts. So there's like devices that read what the brain is doing, and they can tell that a seizure is coming and then deliver a little shock and keep the seizure from happening. And that's
so cool.
Oh, it's a huge improvement in quality of life for the people who have regular seizures. And it's kind of interesting because we don't actually know why that works yet. We don't know why shocking someone deep in their brain stops a seizure, but it does. So that's great. So we're going to keep doing it. And maybe we'll understand more about the brain by doing stuff like that over time. But so this field envisions in the future maybe being able to make, you know, instead of fixing issues that people have, maybe improving in situations where there aren't issues. So maybe we'd be able to have a brain-computer interface that detects that you are starting to doze off while you're driving, and it kind of fixes, you know, gives you a little shock, and now you pay better attention. Or
yeah, because that's something that would be easy for an electron, you know, like we know exactly what waves happen in the brain when somebody's getting tired. Like it seems like a really easy application.
Well, so we know what kind of waves people get in the brain when they're getting tired. But so if you have one of these devices, a problem is managing to measure enough of the brain. So like if you're doing an EEG, that's like when you put one of those things on your scalp and it's got all those electrodes all over your head, you're getting a lot of information from a lot of different parts of your brain, and you get a pretty good vision of what's happening on your brain. But you wouldn't want to wear that while you're driving, or you wouldn't want to wear that to school.
And you really couldn't, because you have to put like the gooey gel like on your scalp for every single electrode. It actually, if you've ever gotten an EEG, it like takes time to get that thing set up on your head.
Yeah, right. And you can't walk around with it. So trying to find a device that can travel with you and is small is really hard. And so electrocorticography is one thing that's sort of working. So like there's a company called NeuroPace. And I think that this is for the treatment of seizures. I'm forgetting the details, but it goes underneath your skull, and it measures your brain waves in a certain area, and that they're able to pretty much hide the device so that like it kind of just blends in with your hair and you don't really see it. It's not very obvious. But it's, you know, it's taking measurements in a very particular place. And so it's kind of hard to figure out what kinds of devices we'll need if you want to do complicated things like, will you be able to get enough brain waves to know that someone's kind of getting sleepy, and can you, like, you know, give them a zap before they fall asleep on the road?
And is it worth it to them to have like an invasive surgery just so that they can do that later?
Exactly. So this particular technique is sort of in the middle of how invasive these techniques can get. So you can get, there's a device called the Utah array and the Michigan array, and these are essentially like, it looks like you stick a fork in the brain, and you get very specific readings around the tines of the fork. But, you know, imagine you stick a fork in Jell-O that's the shape of the brain. As you move around, that fork causes damage to the surrounding area. And so for that technique, you get really good readings, but at the moment, you can't put that in people's brains for day-to-day stuff because you're causing brain damage. And like as people learn to use the devices that are attached to these arrays, the brain is degrading and you're losing the ability to use the device that's attached to it.
Oh my gosh, it reminds me of like when you watch a commercial for some sort of drug, you know, and it's like for allergy medicine or something. It's like, are you sick of having a runny nose? Take this drug. May cause loss of smell, death, you know, runny nose. And you're like, wait a minute, I thought that's what I was trying to fix.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, no, it's horrible. And so people are trying to develop materials that start off like hard enough that you could put it into a brain and get it in the right position. And then once it's in position, it becomes really soft so that it moves as the brain wiggles. But that's a really hard material science problem.
And it's also really going to be something that unless the risk-benefit analysis works in your favor, you have Parkinson's and you're trying to do deep brain stimulation so that you can relieve the Parkinson's symptoms. Those kinds of surgeries are worthwhile to people. But for actual, improvement, like not necessarily symptom reduction, but, hacking the brain like to improve things, I think that it's probably not going to be worth it for a lot of people. They're going to want something that can read brainwaves from outside the skull, like some sort of weird hat.
Yeah, so most of what we know comes from patients who have, for example, severe epilepsy, because those are the kinds of patients at the moment you can like ethically put these devices into because you're trying to make their lives better. And a lot of them apparently have infinite patience and are willing to let you do all sorts of extra tests while they're in the process of getting these devices so that we can kind of learn about how the brain works in response to these things. But so I was talking to a guy named Dr. Eric Luthart, and he was saying that he thought that you could get something that's like about the size of a thimble and uses electrocorticography, and in this kind of near future, which is like, it doesn't require you to like poke holes in your brain. It just kind of like sits on top. And he was saying that he thought that in the kind of near future, you might be able to get something like that to improve focus. And he thought that it would be a relatively uninvasive procedure that wouldn't have high risks of brain damage or anything. And so I don't know. What's scary about that is that if a couple people get it and they become significantly better at their job, now there's like an arms race, like if the other person who's up for the job got the implant, you feel like maybe you need it too, so that you can also, write 5 papers in a day like that person is doing. And so now we're in this situation where not only, if these devices are expensive, the people who have more access are better able to do work, but now people who are kind of on the fence about the technology might feel like they have to get it. And so that, that's one potential negative implication of these sorts of devices.
You sort of see it in Hollywood right now. I mean, think about it. We're talking about improving cognition, but across the board in Hollywood, you see men and women who kind of have a cosmetic surgery arms race, right? Like they feel the pressure to look like they did 10 years ago. So they may have certain types of surgery to improve their ability to get jobs. And then, some people do it well and, more power to them. And some people start to kind of go off the rails with it. And it's really obvious to people from the outside. And that doesn't even have any effect on their cognitive ability to continue on. It really is like a purely superficial thing. So, I mean, we already have good evidence that people absolutely will do that because they do it in other aspects of their lives. I personally am like really scared of surgery because I've never had it and I've never gone under total anesthesia. And so I have like a weird, I don't think it's a phobia because I do think it's somewhat appropriate to be scared of being, in a twilight state and almost dying and then being brought back by a very sophisticated physician. But to me, even if those benefits were there, that I could write 5 papers a day or I could really improve my output, I don't know if it would be worth it for me to undergo the risk of having to have anesthesia.
Yeah, I agree. And I guess what I'm hoping is that in the future, so, in general society, there's a lot of variability in how quickly we can write, for example, or do science and how smart we are. And so, maybe these devices will move you from being like 1 standard deviation away from the average to 1.5 standard deviations. And maybe those of us like myself who don't want to be implanting things into their brain would say, okay, I'm willing to accept that added competition. I'm not going to do anything about it. But, how good these things get will maybe determine the extent to which people are willing to say, all right, I'm opting out. If it makes someone like 5 standard deviations better than the average, maybe you start to feel like, well, if I want to get in that field, I have to do it. But hopefully we never get to that point. Who knows?
Yeah, I feel like people, my advice to the readers of your book is space it out between like read a chapter in Soonish and then go watch an episode of Black Mirror and then read a chapter in Soonish. Because it's true, some of these themes, I think, what's his name? David? Is it David Brooker? No, that's not right at all. Let's see. I'm Googling it right now. I love the internet. Charlie Brooker. Some of the themes that Charlie Brooker explores in Black Mirror, especially the episode with I can't remember what it's called, but they call it the grain in the episode, the little thing that gets implanted behind people's ears, and it helps them basically record all of their interactions and all of their memories. And some people opt to have it, and some people don't, and it can really be helpful, but it can also really get in the way of interpersonal relationships, and it's just so interesting how a lot of this near future dystopic narrative has a really important and legitimate scientific basis. And I think that you guys do an incredible job of exploring that in your book.
Thank you. I mean, we had a lot of fun thinking about these different technologies, and I actually didn't start watching Black Mirror until we had submitted our manuscript to our publisher. And someone was like, "Oh, you should watch it." And I was like, "Oh my gosh, this stuff is blowing my mind." But I watched 3 episodes, but it was right around the time my son was born. And I had postpartum anxiety, so I was like, "I'm done.
No, yeah.
I'm not watching any more of this." But
no, not a good show to watch if you are not in a good headspace.
No, but it's all better now, and so I think I got to get back to watching more of those. But I did watch the grain episode, and that it's important to think through the possible futures that you could have with these kinds of technologies, so that you can like try to steer the future towards a good future.
Absolutely.
So we just tried to lay out the possibilities, and Black Mirror, shows you an example of a negative route that those things could take.
And it's important. And you guys do that too. You make sure that you don't just forget that and have this like techno-optimist view. And you know what? I would highly recommend anybody who hasn't started Black Mirror, if you start Black Mirror from the beginning, the very first episode is the pig fucker episode, and it'll like really screw with your head. And
God, it will.
And that's kind of one of the darkest ones. So I don't know why they chose to show it first. But if you're afraid you're going to be scared off because it is kind of dark and dystopian, I recommend the most recent season watching San Junipero, because it's actually a really beautiful episode, and it balances. It's probably the most optimistic episode they've ever done, and it balances it really well. So I highly recommend San Junipero. It's gorgeous. And guys, I highly recommend Soonish. So before we go, Kelly, because I've been keeping you for so long, is there anything else that that you're like, why the hell didn't she ask me about this, or why didn't we get into this yet? Was there anything you were like burning to talk about that we didn't get to?
I mean, I would be happy to talk about Soonish all day long. So I'll start the brain-computer interface chapter. The end of it is maybe my favorite part of any interview in the book that I did. So I talked to Gerwin Schock, and he works on electrocorticography. And I asked him, what is the future of brain-computer interfaces? And what I expected to hear him say was, you could be a quadriplegic and we'll be able to give you absolute full use of your limbs back again, something like that. But what he said was, well, at some point, we are going to be able to have the ability to load all of our thoughts up and share them with everyone. So we're going to have all of our thoughts and feelings and knowledge shared amongst everyone at all times, and essentially be like a big superorganism. And on the plus side,
whoa.
Right? So it's real trippy. And so on the plus side, he pointed out something that I do think is quite beautiful, which is that, if you have a moment where like maybe you're walking through the woods and you just see the most beautiful, life-changing scene ever, if you try to explain that to someone in an email, like the little meat bags that are our fingers just often can't do it justice, like the person won't be able to really see what you saw. But if we can share our thoughts, then you can like share that moment with all of its smells and colors and emotions, like with someone else. If they can essentially get into your brain, we can share these important moments in ways that we've never been able to before.
Oh my gosh. And I'm just imagining, sorry to interrupt, but like being able to go to the doctor and say like, these are my symptoms. And you know how there's always a breakdown with things that are really subjective like that. But a doctor being able to be like, I feel your pain. I now know how to treat it because I know exactly what this is.
Yes. And I mean, there's so many diseases like mental health where I feel like sometimes people are like, oh, depression, you're just a little bummed out, like go run. But if
and it's like, no.
Yeah. And if you could be like, no, this is what it feels like. And you could share that with someone. Like, I mean, you could imagine that we would all become much more empathetic and would really understand each other. And it could be beautiful.
Absolutely.
But it could also be horrible because I think that, marriage and in a lot of ways society works because you don't say everything you think.
Yep.
And you go through a couple iterations of your thoughts in your mind before you decide, okay, this is how I really feel about something. Like I played around with, do I want to leave this person? No, I don't, because I've weighed my options and I decided I want to stay. But like if you're sitting on the couch, and this is an example that Gerwin Schock gave, if you're sitting on your couch and you think, well, maybe I want to leave my wife, like she would know immediately, and that would be bad. And so, there's a lot of negatives, and it's hard to know if in the end we would all be more empathetic or we would be much more angry with one another because all of those like little negative thoughts like, oh, that dress doesn't look great on her or something like that you don't say because it's a polite society and you don't need to say stuff like that. Yeah. If all that was shared, maybe that wouldn't be so great. So it's hard to know what kind of future that would end up producing. But it's interesting to think because I feel like at that point, that would be a totally different, like we'd still be humans, but we would be something totally different than we've ever been before if all of our brains were connected. So I thought that was fascinating.
Absolutely. That is fascinating. And it makes me think, people always say like, what is the superpower that you would want? Would you want to fly? And I always do say I'd want to be able to read people's minds, but I also feel like it has to have a kill switch mechanism.
Yes.
Because otherwise I would not be happy. I already struggle with depression. I cannot imagine if I couldn't not hear every thought everybody always has, because you don't want to have that window, stuck open. That would not be good.
No, absolutely. I totally agree. I personally don't necessarily welcome that future, but I do like the idea that maybe we could switch it on and off every once in a while, and I could see a beautiful moment that someone had or really understand how they felt about something, but to constantly be connected, that scares me, to be honest.
Yeah, I actually think there's a really beautiful and like little known movie was it called Final Cut with Robin Williams, where I'm looking it up. I think it was called Final Cut, but if not, my Google search is going really slowly for some reason, but it was about a guy who worked at like, one of those 1 hour photo things in a convenience store, and everybody kind of had, some sort of mechanism inside of them. I don't know if they've ever really even explained it in the film. But what his job was to go through all of the footage, quote unquote, and it has a really low Rotten Tomatoes score, but I thought that it was a brilliant idea for a movie. Yeah, it had some problems, but whatever. He was a cutter. He edited footage from their lives and made these videos, these Final Cut videos that people could watch like at their funerals or afterward. That was sort of like first person perspective from their lives. And of course, the rough part, because it was like a thriller, is that he was doing it from people who were like pretty horrible people. And so he had to sit through all of these hours of terrible things that they did and try and like cut those things out to present them in the best possible light. But it was such a fascinating concept, right? That like everything you ever did was recorded. And in a way, we're sort of getting close to that even without some of these, what we think of as future technologies, even the today technologies. Like you see a politician who did or said something stupid and you're like, how do they not know that everything they do is being recorded?
Yeah. Yeah,
like they should know that by now.
They really should. And that's actually a theme in a lot of the chapters, is about how these various technologies cut into our privacy even more than it already is. And so that's definitely something that's just going to become more of a problem in the future unless society decides to do something about it. But I'm guessing that they don't.
Yeah. And I would say, because I am like the queen of watching like documentaries that make you really uncomfortable, but there's a great documentary I would recommend to anybody listening about that sort of balance between privacy and convenience, which is like, a big part of modern life now, and a big part of like, I guess a lot of the millennial listeners of this show have been born into that world, like the digital natives. It's called Terms and Conditions May Apply. It's by Cullen Hoback, and he does a great job of digging deep into basically what you're signing away when you click I agree, and really all the things that these big multinational companies are doing with your secure data, and how it's a real trade-off so that we don't have to remember our password, or so that we have targeted ads given to us, or they already know what our interests are before we have to click a button. But at the same time, there are people making a lot of money off of your personal information, and exactly how all of that works is fascinating. That's the world we live in already. That's not even the dystopian future. That's the dystopian now.
Yep. I agree.
And that's why I also love the title of your book, Soonish, because I think it really captures that idea that this is all really a continuum. It's not one of those things where we're like, oh, far in the future, this is what it'll be like. We're already sort of there. It's really about iterating, and it's really about, thinking about where it could go, but the trajectory is laid out in front of us already.
Yep, it's up to us.
Absolutely. Kelly, okay, I kept you for so long. We've been recording for an hour and 15 minutes. I feel terrible, but my fans would kill me if I didn't ask you the final two questions, because I know that your answers are going to be really interesting, and they're so aligned with this book as it is and all of the work you've been doing. So you okay if I close the show asking you the same two questions I ask everybody?
Yeah, I'm having a ton of fun. Keep asking.
Yay. Okay, cool. So when you think about the future, which you've been doing for as long as you've been working on this book, plus even more time, two sides of kind of a similar coin here. Number one, what is the thing that keeps you up the most at night, that, is the most disconcerting to you, that's the most worrisome to you? And of course, this is within any context. It can be a technological future, the future of like global humanity. It can just be the future of you and your own family or your own career. So, whatever context you want to answer the question. But number one, what is the thing that is the most worrisome and keeps you up the most at night? And on the flip side of that, what are you the most really excited and hopeful and optimistic about?
Okay, so that's a good question. So I guess to be honest, so I'd like to have a big, lofty, humanity level answer to that. But what's actually keeping me awake at night is the stuff that's happening in Charlottesville, Virginia, because we just moved there.
Yeah.
And my husband's family is Jewish. And literally there were Nazis waving swastika flags 2 blocks away from the house where I just moved my family.
Wow. I mean, oh my God. I mean, we all know this, but of course for it to be right down the street, it's just insane. It's 2017.
Yeah, and so I thought that rally would be the end, but they were back about a week and a half ago, I think, and there were only 40 or maybe even less of them. It was Richard Spencer brought them back, and so they don't seem to be going anywhere. And then my daughter's school was on lockout recently because someone said something about how it would be great if someone pulled a Las Vegas on the Charlottesville school system. Which essentially means killed a lot of children. And so, she was locked into her school, and they still went to school, but they couldn't go on the playground. And so just kind of trying to make decisions about what do you do? Because I don't want to run away. I feel like where there are bad people around, it's good for, obviously I have a bias on what side is good and what side is bad here, but I think history is on my side.
Yeah.
So, when bad people come around, it's good for good people to stay. But at some point you have to take care and protect your children. And so I'm trying to decide, do we keep her in the school system when you get these threats? And do we stay in this town when the Nazis keep coming back? Yeah. And so anyway, I guess that's not really a tech answer, but that is pretty much the only thing that's keeping me up at night, because my life is pretty great otherwise.
Well, and the truth of the matter is some of these geopolitical, sociological, and in this case, just pure kind of psychological, just this is just pure unadulterated racism. These types of interpersonal issues have to be sorted. They have to be well understood in parallel with, the types of things that we think of when we talk about future technology, because this is the human component of the futurism stuff. These people and these interactions will always exist in tandem. And if we ignore this whole side of the future, basically we're setting ourselves up for a very naive failure.
Right. And technology is an important part of this stuff. The rally was organized over the internet. And you can't, like you said, you can't disassociate these things. So that's what keeps me up at night. But things to be optimistic and excited about. So one of the things that we really wanted to convey in this book was that there are lots of really awesome challenges that people are working on. And I just think So like whenever I watch the video of like Curiosity landing on Mars, like I get choked up because humanity there are problems that seem insurmountable, and a bunch of us get together and we think really hard, and then we do these amazing things, and it's just so, we are capable of such amazing highs and such amazing lows, which actually I think ties together really nicely. The Nazis did the Holocaust. That's got to be one of the lowest lows ever. But yet we can also land a rover on Mars. And that's just such a beautiful thing that we've managed to do with our amazing minds and with amazing hard work. And so I just thinking about the fact that there are amazing people working on all of the problems that we laid out in this book, I just get really excited about that. Just humanity is amazing. There's amazing things that we decide that we want to try to overcome. And sometimes we do it. And maybe we'll make all of these technologies happen. And hopefully the future will be positive with them. And we'll just have to wait and see.
What a lovely thought to close out this episode with. Kelly, thank you so much for joining me. I'm just thrilled that we had the chance to get together. I'm thrilled to be able to share this incredible book with all the listeners of Talk Nerdy. Once again, the book is called Soonish. It's by Kelly and Zach Weinersmith. The subtitle is 10 Emerging Technologies That'll Improve and or Ruin Everything. And it is available now, right?
Yeah. It came out October 17th. And we just found out that on Sunday, we're going to be on the New York Times bestseller list.
Oh my gosh, how exciting. Oh, that's great. Yay. Because this podcast will air on Monday. So one day on the New York Times bestseller list so far. And guys, you should grab your copy now before it sells out. Kelly, thank you so much for joining me. Let me know, or let everybody listening know, where they can find you in social media to say hello and that they enjoyed the episode.
So you can find Zach on Twitter at ZachWeiner, and you can find me on Twitter at FUSCHMU, Fushmu. It's a long story, but now I'm stuck with it. So you can find us on Twitter, and that would be a great place to tell us that you enjoyed this episode. And I also have a website, Weinersmith.com.
Love it. All right. Well, thank you so much for joining me once again. And everybody listening, thank you for coming back week after week. I'm really looking forward to the next time we all get together to talk nerdy.